welcome to Let's Talk Tax, the go-to podcast for growth-minded CPAs and real estate professionals in tax. I'm your host, Justin Gephart. Welcome back to those watching on YouTube and Spotify, and to all others listening in.
Joining us today on Let's Talk Tax is fellow co-host Dave McGuire. Welcome, Dave.
Good to be here, Justin.
You know, coming off of an election, we always talk about, elections being a busy year for the firm. No matter which party gets into office or who takes control, there seems to always be opportunity. And as we are coming off the election at the end of 2024, obviously a lot of hot topics out there. And I think that's a lot of stuff that we will focus on in season 2. Dave, what are some of the highlights that you would anticipate that we're going to tackle?
I think, as you mentioned, Justin, anytime there's an election, it brings opportunity, brings change. This year actually might be even more than most because we have that expiring TCJA provision. As you remember, the TCJA in 2017 was designed to expire. And so we're going to see tax legislation coming down the pipe one way or another. Whether you like it or not, that's coming. But you couple that with some of the uncertainty around tariffs, around changes to the economy, around changes to the global market in terms of how trade is working. There's going to be a lot of differing things going on this year that's going to affect people, and that's going to create some opportunities for those CPA firms and those real estate professionals that really want to access opportunities.
Yeah, I think even in addition to the federal side, you see a lot of talk on the state side around the property tax. So I think it's another area that impacts our firm and one that we'll want to keep our eye on. I know Governor DeSantis out of Florida has made comments about wanting to eliminate property tax from that perspective. So, and there have been several other states to follow. So there should be a lot of development, whether any of that gets momentum or not throughout the year, both on the federal and state side. Dave, when we look ahead to 2025 and some of the areas that may be coming down the pike in terms of legislation, what would you anticipate in terms of timing on a lot of this stuff to be tackled?
Well, I think it depends on what we're talking about. Obviously, we've already seen the effects of tariffs coming in and out. Early on in the new administration, we saw them put on Canada and Mexico and then pulled back and then put back on again. So some of that's immediate. Now, when we talk about big legislation and the big issues, whether it be in the one big beautiful bill as they've determined it through the House and the president's been pushing for, or we see multiple smaller bills, I wouldn't expect to see much of that until later this year. We should start seeing some glimpses of what it looks like, maybe late spring, early summer. But I don't think we'll get the full details behind it until we get probably closer to the fall. We definitely will have it by the end of the year because they're not going to want to see individual rates go back up in 2026, which they are required to do if they don't change anything.
With a lot of, even if you look at it from a Doge perspective and all these cuts that they're trying to undertake, some key agencies are being shed in terms of the workforce, which could trickle into, from the IRS perspective, how do they attack audits? How are they processing certain claims? I mean, we've seen ERC over the last couple of years get paused. Dave, think about the REAP grants and how those are being affected with some of the legislation. So there's a lot. I think 2025 is going to be a very active year when we take a look at it from a legislation perspective.
Yeah, we're already starting to see some of those, as you mentioned, Justin. Is we've seen some places where the IRS is willing to settle audits that have been ongoing for a while. We've seen places where, with, as you mentioned, the REAP grants, where the funding was paused on paying those out. Even people that were awarded them have seen that funding pause. Now, whether or not that pause will continue without some type of legislative change, what the powers that I think there's going to be some interesting controls between the power of Congress and the power of the presidency, and where that actually ends up playing out at the end of the day is yet to be seen. Just as you mentioned, I mean, a lot of these things are new ideas. So you mentioned, for example, on property tax, DeSantis wanting to do away with property tax. Well, the devil's in the details there. So is that individual property tax? Does that include commercial stuff? Do they shift the tax burden from the individual to the corporate to the lessees? How does that work? Because still needs to be money coming in. So you start eliminating too much. Money needs to come in from somewhere. So how do they do it? And where does that shift the burden and where does that create opportunities?
Exactly. And I think the key phrase you said is just the creating opportunities. As we talk about the tariffs, there's obviously major implications because of that. But our location advisory practice has seen significant traction in companies wanting to reshore their activities here in the States as a result of that, or out of fear of what those tariffs could mean for their business. And so I think whether it's federal, whether it's state, whether it's some of this international dealings, the administration's approach to business over the next 100 days, over the next year, is going to be key in a lot of those areas. I mean, we're seeing on the location advisory side, you know, Chinese investment into the states. It's kind of treated very, very far away at this point. No one's got a lot of interest in welcoming that type of investment right now.
It'll be interesting to see. Some of it you need to see some type of stability before we'll see that change. And so that's why I think some of these tax bills that should be coming down in the second half of the year will provide some of that stability and that long-term planning. The issue comes in when you go, okay, where are the tariffs going next week? Where is this going next month? Where is this going in a year? Makes it hard for investment to follow. I mean, you mentioned our location advisors, our international team at the same time. If tariffs start hitting hard on, let's say, Canada, do you shift some of your supply chains to a different country where tariffs aren't hitting hard, or is that a temporary blip that could change? Those are conversations we're having with people now, and I think those will continue throughout the next year until we see that stability start to come in and a return to a little bit of normal business practices as it moves through the year. But that doesn't change the opportunity for those conversations and that planning should not wait for that, because by the time that stability comes, you're already one step behind.
Yep. So some of the key things that our team would be watching over the next year to see if there's any change on it. Obviously, 174, which has been a big discussion point over the last 12 to 18 months. Bonus depreciation. Those are probably two of our biggest days. What other areas do you think that would have impact?
I think, as you mentioned, 174 and bonus depreciation are two of the biggest. 174, although there's some bills floating around saying, hey, we want a retroactive, we're expecting that that's going to be a prospective change. Bonus depreciation, we're probably looking at changes back to January 20th, based on the president's speech to the joint session of Congress. We also are expecting there's going to be some clawback in some of the IRA provisions. We just don't know what that looks like. So whether that's some of the corporate tax increases that were included in it, whether that's a clawback on some of the grants and incentives and tax credits that were included, or if that's just simply a clawback on things like the $80 billion worth of additional funding for the IRS, those are going to change. Now, unfortunately, and we could be wrong because this is obviously a promo video for what's going to happen, I don't think we're going to get anything in a permanent setting, or not much. Most of this is going to be a temporary tax bill again, just due to the difficulty in pushing anything permanent without having 60 members of any one party in the Senate.
Dave, I've spent some time with some of our CPA firms over the last couple of days, and one topic that was surprisingly kind of came about is they're having a lot of struggle on the interest limitation. A lot of their clients in today's environment they have high interest expenses, and the way that it's written right now, the way that it's being enforced right now, that limitation is affecting a lot of clients. Have you heard something similar on that effect?
Oh, that's definitely been an issue on 160. So what you're talking about is the 163J interest limitation, and that's where it was. That was an added thing under the TCJA. We didn't used to have that, obviously. Then they started tying it to EBITDA for the first couple of years, and then a few years ago that switched to EBIT. So now you don't get to include that depreciation and amortization, or exclude that depreciation and amortization expense. So for companies that have a big depreciation number, that depreciation or that interest limitation can hit at a very low number. So somebody that's sitting there with $1 million worth of EBITDA, but a $900,000 depreciation expense is sitting there with only $100 of EBIT income, and they're sitting there going, "Wait, I get to deduct 20% of my interest? That's only 20 grand." And so changing that back to EBITDA or getting rid of it altogether would be a huge benefit for a lot of those businesses. The issue is a lot of the planning that goes around it can create permanent changes to your business in terms of electing real property trade or business or doing other things. And so right now, most people should be holding off until we see what those changes look like before they go and do wholesale changes that might affect them down the road.
Perfect. Well, I think just over the last couple of minutes, we've hopefully kind of summarized it. There's going to be a lot of moving parts in this upcoming year. So expect a lot of discussions around some of these legislative updates. But as we talk about the structure and the format of season 2, our firm continues to grow. So does kind of our approach with this information and how we're going to conduct the conversation in season 2. One thing that we're going to be switching up, and I think it'll be curious to get your insights on this, Dave, is bringing in guest panels, people that are out in the market, whether it's CPA firms, whether that's brokers, bankers from an economic forecast standpoint. We're really coming at it from our approach, okay, we have so many strategic resources that we're fortunate to be a part of, to try to bring that information and share that with the rest of our Alliance network. Dave, what are some of the things that you're excited about, or some of the discussions that you're looking forward to with those type of guests?
I think it's going to be exciting to see what people see outside of what we see on a daily basis. Now, we see a lot of companies, a lot of different industries, we cover a lot of different areas, but we still only touch a very small percentage of the tax code. And it's going to be interesting talking to people that are dealing with this in reality. Because it's one thing if we just sat there, you and I just a minute ago talked about 163J or that interest limitation. It's one thing for us to talk about it in theory. It's another thing to sit down with somebody who's actually going through it and saying, okay, I've got a car dealership. I've got a lot of floor plan interest financing. How does that affect my day-to-day business when I've got to deal with these limitations? Or when we start talking about bonus depreciation, you start saying, okay, how does that affect a business making decisions or a CPA moving forward? CPA firms, what are the conversations they've had to have around 174 and the issues? Bringing in those external guests that have more tangible real world experience with how these affect taxpayers on a day-to-day basis is going to make a lot of this more meaningful to the end user.
And that overall, I mean, whether you're a CPA firm in Atlanta or a CPA firm on the West Coast or Midwest, we all share in the same type of problems. We go through the same obstacles, we have the same challenges, and so I think what we're trying to do is put a little spotlight on those type of discussions and hopefully share how some firms are approaching some of these challenges in the last year and looking ahead over the next 1 to 2 years.
Yeah, not to make it too touchy-feely there, Justin, but a lot of the differences, people concentrate right now, whether it be in politics, whether it be in business, whether it be in anything else, on differences. And when you sit down and get to it, everybody just wants things to be better. They want the economy to be doing well. They want people to be making money. They want businesses to do well. So now we've got to sit down and actually start saying, okay, what are those things that tie us together? Where are those opportunities, and how do we look for those and help these businesses grow together as a group?
Well, Dave, I'm excited for season 2. I think with the adjustments to the format, bringing in guests, I think what our listeners can expect, just to kind of really quickly recap what we just spent a few minutes talking about, legislative updates, as the new administration gets their feet underneath them, seeing what kind of policies they try to implement. As we've seen in the first 100 days, they stop, they pause, they put them back on. So as that becomes a little bit more concrete, we're going to have a lot of updates, especially on the legislation side, and how that strategically may impact taxpayers. And then listening to pain points, success stories, challenges, obstacles that a lot of our alliance partners and those out in the industry are going through and how they're overcoming those. So I think it's going to be an exciting season 2, and looking forward to a lot of the conversations.
Well, thank you for having me here today, Justin. I agree. It's going to be an exciting year. And I think there's going to be a lot of opportunity to talk to a lot of different people. There's going to be a lot of change. As people always say, is that change is where people make the most money. It's kind of millionaires are made through recessions and change. And anytime there's a change, it's how do we look for the opportunities? So I'm looking forward to, over the next year, really talking about where those opportunities create. And I'm excited about the new format where we get to bring in people. I think sometimes we get so interested in what we're talking about, we forget that sometimes it gets stale talking to the same people over and over. So bringing in those new experts is really going to bring a breath of fresh air.
Absolutely. Thanks, Dave, and thank you to all our listeners. Hope you enjoy the season 2.
Thank you for taking time to tune in today. You can subscribe to the Let's Talk Tax podcast on YouTube and follow us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. In addition, today's show notes and links to more about the episode can be found online at McGuiresponsel.com/Let's Talk Tax Podcast. We'll see you next week. Thanks, everyone.